Hi everyone, welcome to week 5. Can you believe we're only a week off being halfway through the course? Unbelievable. All right, today we're doing sexual offenders. So I will warn you that there is content in this week that can be distressing. This is a criminology course after all. So we are going to be talking about sexual offending today, and if it triggers anything in you, I please ask you just turn it off and walk away. There's some contacts for the Mount Gravatt campus and same contacts for Gold Coast. So Lynn Shannon at Mount Gravatt, Chris Hannigan at the Gold Coast, or please call Lifeline if you get really upset by what you see today. All right, the learning objectives for this week. So today we're going to explain the difference between criminological and psychological approaches to sexual offending and offenders. We're going to look at the rapist typologies because we don't sort of think about the fact that there could be different types of rapists with different things that they want as the outcome from the rape. What is it within them that they're trying to assuage by raping someone? We're going to look at some of the different theories only for today, and only very briefly, but don't we just love the theories? Okay. And we're going to talk about the Dangerous Prisoners Sex Offenders Act 2003. This was the legislative reaction to sex offenders, but we'll also talk about community reactions as well. And we'll talk about the person who started it all off and why it came into being. So, lecture overview, crim versus psych approaches, definitions. What do we mean by rape? Rape patterns and typologies, theoretical perspectives, case studies. We'll do Raymond Garland, we're actually going to do in the tutorial, and we'll look at Dennis Ferguson in the lecture. And they're both Queensland cases, by the way, although Dennis was from New South Wales, he ended up here. So he has a very big Queensland link, and Raymond Garland is a Queenslander. And we'll look at sexually violent predator laws. I've got a couple of other case studies to look at as well, including a female sex offender. Okay, so the dominant approach has been psychology. Are these, so the tendency for study to be done within the psychology discipline. Let me just move that down the bottom there so you can see that. All right, so are these types of offenders different from other types of offender? From a psychological perspective, we're only looking at the individual and whether they differ from other individuals. There is an assumption that sexual offenders specialise in their offending. Well, what do you think the term specialise means when it comes to offending? Well, specialist is said to only commit that type of crime, so they don't commit other types of crimes. A general offender will commit other types of crimes such as burglary or anything that is non-sexual. In the main, the child sex offenders are usually specialist offenders. So they're the ones that are going to stick to sex offences only, and they won't commit any other type of crime. Adult sex offenders tend to be more versatile, but specialist offending is the domain of child sex offenders. The assumption is that sexual offenders are substantially different to other offenders. In the main, looking at the research, they're not that much different in personality. Okay, so research suggests no specific personality traits differentiate child sex offenders. So the research is showing that there's not much difference in personality. There is limited use of criminological approaches. So these lead to theories and treatment programs that focus on sexual deviancy. Today we're focusing on the individual and sexual offending, even though we should be looking at them holistically and at what other types of crimes they are committing. Today, the focus of the lecture is just on sexual offending. General theories will look at any type of crime, so they don't necessarily apply to sex offenders, but maybe they should be used if sex offenders do commit more than one crime. But there is an emerging interest in the versatility of offending by men convicted of a sexual offence and the application of criminological models. Okay, definitions. The following are definitions from the code, because I don't know how many of you could say definitely what constitutes rape. This is in Queensland only, because remember, every state has their own code, as it were, criminal code, and they may vary slightly. So this is just from the criminal code. So rape. I'll just let you read through that for a second. Okay. When we talk about consent, we need to understand certain conditions where consent cannot be given. If a person is asleep, unconscious, impaired by alcohol or drugs, they cannot give consent. And this is not gender specific, it is a person to person decision that is made. But we must understand that it is all about the cognitive capacity of the person to give consent. And the maximum penalty is life in prison, not often given, but it is there. Sexual assault. Okay. Procures another person without the person's consent. That is to knowingly entice or recruit another person for the purpose of sexual indecency. So in other words, procuring people to almost prostitute themselves without them, you're knowingly enticing them to do it, but they don't necessarily know that that's what they are being enticed to do. Witness an act of gross indecency. This could be watching the offender masturbate or something like that. Inappropriate touching or groping as well, but watching another sexual act without the person's consent. Maximum penalty is 10 years, but don't forget, there's always aggravating circumstances such as having a weapon will make it a little bit harsher. Offences against morality. So unlawful sodomy can be a term of life imprisonment if the child is under 12 and suffering from an impairment. It is 14 years if the child is aged 12 to 18 years. Indecent treatment of children under 16. This includes fondling, nude photos, making children watch pornography. The term of imprisonment rises if the child is under 12. Carnal knowledge with or of children under 16. Life if the child is under 12. Using the internet, etc., to procure children under 16. This is a relatively new law that has to be brought in. So when we talk about the fact that not everything that is law has been there for a long time, this is one of those relatively new laws because we've had so many issues on the internet with adults using the internet to groom. So that's the next one. Again, a relatively new law as far as the internet is concerned, but it's been there for a long time as person to person. So these laws have to come in when we have this new technology. And grooming children, building a rapport and emotional connection with a child and gaining their trust towards, looking towards sexual contact. So we now see this has been investigated thoroughly with the Royal Commission, where we've seen many organisations, including the church-run institutions. Australian Defence Force cadets did not come out of this lightly, neither did Scouts, and neither did a lot of sporting clubs, where a lot of grooming was going on by adults looking to have sexual contact with children. So these laws are there, they're all offences against morality. And how sad is it and unfortunate that we need to have these laws. Okay, but what then is pedophilia? So it's rarely used with any consistency, and in and of itself is not a crime. It is not a crime to be a pedophile. It's used a lot without people knowing exactly what it means. It only becomes a crime when it is acted upon. So there's many pedophiles out there that have the fantasies, but they have the self-control to never ever touch child. So therefore they're not breaking any laws just by being a pedophile. So what is pedophilic disorder? And this comes from the DSM-5. So that's the Diagnostic Statistics Manual number 5. This is the psychology Bible that gives you all of the different psychological disorders and what you have to have happening to you to make you part of that disorder. Recurrent, intense, sexually arousing fantasies, sexual urges or behaviours involving sexual activity with a prepossessing child. The person has acted on these sexual urges, or the sexual urges or fantasies cause marked distress or interpersonal difficulty. So it is a disorder, but not necessarily a crime. Pedophilia is not a legal term, but is covered by rape, sexual assault, indecency, making or possessing child pornography, etc. So you won't see someone arrested and put into prison for the offence of pedophilia. Okay, that it's covered by those other things. Lara Christensen, who's the lady that used to teach this course before me, has a chapter in a book called The Psychology of Crime and Antisocial Behaviour, and she talks about pedophiles there, and she makes the point that not all pedophiles are child sexual offenders, and not all child sexual offenders are pedophiles. So child sexual offenders may hold a sexual preference towards adults, yet offend against children merely due to the opportunity for sexual gratification. So what that simply means is that they can't find an adult to have sex with or to force themselves upon, so they will pick a child simply because they're opportunistic, and they can do it much easier, overpower a child much easier than they can an adult. Okay, so not all child sex offenders are pedophiles, but not all people who are pedophiles will actually go on to offend against children. And it's important that we make those distinctions. All right, so patterns and typology. So from the information made available by the victim, police might be able to find out what typology the offender is. So this is where we're going to talk about the different types of offenders and rapists. So research using British data on stranger rape found the following characteristics. And again, how can we find out this information? Those who report to the police are more likely to report a stranger rape than a family rapist. So we need to always think about the data and where it comes from when we're looking at these things. Okay, stranger rape it happens a lot, but there's also a lot of familial or family or friends type rape that's not reported. So controlling the victim, what do we mean by that? Well, are they bound or gagged? Is there the use of a mask or a blindfold? Did they use a weapon? Theft from the victim. Personal property can be demanded and stolen from the victim. A very small percentage of stranger rapes will do this, and sometimes it's about having a trophy, something to keep to show each of their victims. The involvement. So how involved do they get with their victim? Do they compliment their victim on the way they look? Do they reassure them? Do they imply that they know the victim? Okay, so they might make comments during the act, complimenting on the way they look, but suggesting that they know each other. They might try to kiss their victim to make it seem consensual. And they could also try and reassure the victim. This could come from the victim having been stalked, so the offender might feel like they really do know the victim. And hostility, so threats and demeaning comments. This is where the clothing will be removed in a violent manner. They could attempt anal penetration. The victim could be threatened and verbally insulted with the use of demeaning or insulting language. This one is less about the sexual side and more about pent-up anger and the violence involved over the victim. Okay, whoa, that yellow is not easy to read. Let's see if I can highlight it and make it darker. Let's just change it into red. The advantages of not opening them up in a slideshow or something is that I can make on the run changes when this happens. So that's good. Okay. All right. So Hazelwood is an offender profiler. So he can classify offences based on the details of what happens during the rape with information from the victims. And they came up with these 4 different types of rapists. So I'll go through all of these. This is all available in the textbook, so don't be too worried if you don't get down what I say, although you can listen to it over and over if you feel that way. Power assurance rapist, this is the commonest type of rapist. So this rapist uses the rape to deal with insecurities about his masculinity, but as the offence may not help as the insecurities are really deep, will rape again perhaps after a short interval. Does not usually use a lot of force or weapons, but may use threats. There is usually planning involved, and the victim may have been watched. If the victim is passive, sexual fantasies may be played out, and a trophy such as clothing may be taken for use in future masturbation. The power assertive rapist is your sexually confident rapist. The rape expresses his virility and sexuality and power over women. Finds his victims at social locations such as clubs or pubs and will appear friendly at first, but may change quickly. Violence is likely to be extreme, particularly in the later stages. This is not a typical rapist, as they're socially skilled, and this pattern may be common in date rape. Offending can be scattered and irregular in terms of offending frequency. We're getting more and more violent and angry as we go with these as well. So your third one is your anger retaliatory rapist. Extremely high levels of anger towards women that may lead to degrading activities being involved in the rape. It involves short, intense, blitz-like attacks. Characteristically, there is a similarity between the victim and the woman he has a grudge against. May attack fairly regularly due to a build-up of the anger. If you think back to someone like Ted Bundy, a lot of the women that he took were women that looked like the lady he thought was his sister was his mother. So he had a really big grudge there, and so he took out his grudge by raping and murdering women who looked quite similar. And the anger excitement rapist, so this is the least common type, thank goodness, and this is the rapist that gains pleasure and sexual excitement from the distress of his victim. So torture and the infliction of pain is very common, and the level of violence may lead to the killing of the victim. Careful and methodological planning of the offence takes place. So tools will be brought to the scene, such as blindfolds, gags and ropes, and the incident may be photographed or videoed. Attacks are on total strangers and are usually irregular due to the careful planning that has to take place. Okay, so you will need to know these for the exam. There's usually always a question on there about the different types of rapists. Okay, let's keep going. My apologies for my phone ringing. I forgot to tell my husband not to ring me because I was taping, so he did. Never mind. All right, explaining child sexual abuse. So there's a number of models proposed to explain child sex offending. We know that men who do this have usually had a very troubled childhood. One study found that 92% of those who sexually molest children had been abused themselves. So there's vulnerability factors in the childhoods of young sex offenders which predispose them to committing sexual offences against children. We need to keep in mind too that there has just been the rape of a 5-year-old boy by children who were aged between 10 and 13 in far north Queensland. So I should imagine that it will be looked into the past of these offending children to see whether they themselves have been abused as a risk factor for what they have done to this little boy, and try and work with them from there, I suppose. Howitt's sexualization model assumes early childhood experience such as abuse are conducive with the development of pedophilia. So what happens in childhood, especially if it involves abuse from a female that is severe and frequent, you're more likely to develop pedophilia. If they are abused sexually as a child, they will believe that those types of adult-child sexual relationships are normal because that is all they know. They think it is normal to want to have sex with children. A little story that I can tell you here. I had a friend many years ago who was a teacher, and when she was at Teachers Training College, so we're talking now a couple of decades ago, they were actually talking about child sexual offending because these people were going to be working with children. And one of the girls got up and ran out. Now, this girl was about 18 years old, turned out that she had been a victim of sexual offending from her father all her life, and she actually thought it was normal. So she was very distressed when she actually found out that it wasn't, and what he'd been doing was wrong. So if a child grows up, it's the same with violence. If they grow up in a household that is violent, then they will be more likely to be violent. Okay, so the sexualization model put into a diagram. So early abusive sexual experiences can lead to being a pedophile adult taking this journey, especially if it is extreme or repeated, will lead to possibly them having sexual experiences with their peers, so with other kids at a very young age. That can lead to them having a pedophile career as an adolescent and lead to them becoming a pedophile adult. Okay, so that's in a nutshell how it can start for children. All right. But what happens when you close the case and let them out into the real world? Well, this study by Simon Hackett of Durham University, and I had the pleasure of listening to him talk about this experiment at a conference last year. He actually looked at adults who had had childhood interventions for harmful sexual behaviour. So these were the victims of sexual behaviour as children. They found 700 cases. 117 were followed up, 87 were traced, and 69 participated in the study. They hadn't talked to anyone else about what had happened to them as children, that they wanted to share to help other kids. And all of these people needed ongoing support as adults. So as you can see here, these were people that had had interventions, but the interventions had finished when they were still quite young, and they didn't get any ongoing support, which was desperately needed. So 97% of them were male, 38% had a learning disability, 41% were living at home, 12% with relatives, and 30% were on a care order. So we're not really seeing here a big rate of people who've gone out into the world on their own and made it as it was. But what he also found was recidivism was low. More did non-sexual offending. Sorry, these were not, okay, I'll go back to the previous slide and start again. These were not people who had been victims. They had been offenders, but they had been offenders as young people. So they'd had interventions after they had been caught, but when they became adults, i.e. turned 18, the interventions all stopped and they had no ongoing support from there. My apologies, I'm trying to do this from memory and I've forgotten a little bit. All right, so what did he find? Well, recidivism was low. Recidivism as a sex offender was low, but they did do non-sexual offending. And what were their life outcomes? Well, you can see that there. So 43% were unsuccessful in life with holding a job and having a family. 26% were successful at putting it behind them and leading a normal life, with 31% having mixed success. So even if you add the successful and the mixed together, that's really only 57%. So that's only just over half of them that have more or less made their way in life. And only 3% of them actually had a charge of sexual assault as an adult. So when we talk about young sex offenders, we're talking here about kids that need to have ongoing interventions and assistance going through life to try and lead them to having some sort of normal life. And we're talking here about people who go on to have jobs, who go on to have relationships, have children, and do all the normal things that most of us probably take for granted. So how do we measure success? Well, they need to have help to live with the legacy of past behaviour. So if the police are still hounding them and still talking to them and, you know, keeping an eye on them, they're still connected to something from over 20 years ago that can play on their minds and be a negative thing. Intervention and focus, so leaving intervention when still a young person with no understanding of their behaviour. So the intervention itself miss the point by looking backward at their past behaviour and not forward into the future and how to not do it again. So the intervention needs to be quite focused and forward looking, which is a rehabilitation focus, not a retribution focus where it's all backward looking. Support intimate partner success and parenting. Well, do you disclose to your partner? So support disclosure to their partners and mentoring for those becoming parents with a lot of parenting programs so that the cycle does not repeat. Meaningful family work. Well, there was no resolution for the families of victims for what happened. So these victims then struggled as teenagers to resolve their behaviour. So you need to do meaningful work with families where the victim lives to make sure that they are looked after as well. Stability of support and social anchors. This is all about turnover of staff. So if they find a staff person that they identify with, that they can feel comfortable with, and then that person gets moved or they move on, then it can create a lot of instability in the support that they're getting. So continuity of the staff is really important to provide lifelong support. And raises the issue of the fragmentation between the child and adult system. So we need to challenge this once an offender, always an offender orthodoxy, because as we've discussed, a lot of adolescent limited offenders do silly things when they're kids, and then their brain develops and they realise that they've been idiots and they never do anything again. And young sex offenders are no different. If they do something, they can grow up to be fully functioning normal adults. But if they have this hanging over their head that once an offender, always an offender, it'll make it really, really difficult for them to move on with their lives. Okay, that is the end of part one, and I forgot to put an end of part one slide. That's the end of part one though. So I will sign off and see you in part two.